Here's to good friends.
Cheers.
Cheers.
That's sort of an oaky afterbirth.
What was that?
She did tell me to get a beer and some cheese fries over at Eskimo Joe's.
That's very nice, lovely. I only hope you feel this way when I'm done. Because I could destroy this night in 2 seconds.
Why is that funny?
Well, I think it's a bit funny to be trying to define nothing.
Smooth as a bourbon on a summer day. Strong as a peated scotch in the winter night. This is a fair warning. The Catholic Man Show is about to begin.
Slap some bacon on a biscuit and let's go. We're burning daylight.
Welcome to the Catholic Man Show. We're on the Lord's team, the winning side. So raise your glass. I'm Adam Minahan, sitting here with David Niles, and we have a new good friend of ours that I've been extremely excited to have on the show. This has been at least a month and a half, maybe 2 months in the making. But we have Pat Flynn, writer, philosopher, business and fitness coach. He has a website called chroniclesofstrength.com. He has a very famous podcast called The Pat Flynn Show that I'm a big fan of. Pat, thanks for hanging out with us this evening.
Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I want to give you, like...
Before you do,
yes.
Pat, I just want to say I appreciate the title of your show. We here at the Catholic Man Show also are very creative when it comes to, like, what should we call our show that's for Catholic men? The Catholic Man Show.
I always introduce it as the humbly and originally named Pat Flynn Show.
Yeah. Well, there are no other
cheers.
Pat Flynn shows that we know of, so it's original as you are.
There's actually 3 other Pat Flynns online that fake Pat Flynns, obviously not real
Right.
Pat Flynns.
Yeah.
Naturally.
Hater
both
Pat
of
Flynns.
them, hater Pat Flynns, fake Pat Flynns, however you want to, as long as it's not, we know who the real Pat Flynn is. And they're on YouTube. They've got podcasts. So, hey, we all have our crosses to bear, right?
Indeed.
Well, the best,
Mine is sitting next to me, but
imitation is the best form of flattery. Thanks a lot, Dave. So Pat, I was introduced to your show by a mutual friend of ours, Carlo Broussard. He was on your show, and I was talking to him, and I had a question about essence. He was on our show not too long ago, and he said something on our show, and I had a question about it. I wasn't sure exactly how to articulate it, so I shot him an email, and he said, hey, I'm actually going to be on this show called the Pat Flynn Show. Check it out with Gavin Kerr. And that was when you first started the intro to the Aquinas' 5 Ways. It was the first one that you guys did. And so you started off with the first one, which when you're talking about essence and essay and all that stuff, and it was mind-blowing. And so I was super pumped. You introduced me to Gavin Kerr, which I've dug into head first with all of his stuff and tried to find all of his articles. And Dr. Brian Besong was another one that you introduced me to. He's epic. He's awesome. I love his stuff. His debate that he had recently with I can't remember her name. I'm sorry. What was her name?
Megan Fritz.
Megan Fritz. Yeah. I mean, that was a great debate. It was 2 people who didn't necessarily agree with each other on things, but they had a civil conversation, a public discourse that was fruitful, I thought, which is few and far between these days. So thank you for hosting those.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Gavin, Brian, both have become good friends of mine. Megan, the conversation with Megan was interesting because that started as something of a Facebook debate. And as I'm sure the 2 of you are fully aware, Facebook is not the most productive platform to have an exchange. So they were going back and forth on essentially Megan's view of agnostic pluralism, I suppose I would call it. And I was chiming in a little bit here and there. And I said, hey, why don't we just take this off of Facebook? I've got a podcast and we can finish it there. And I'm glad we did, because tone doesn't always transfer so well on Facebook.
Right.
Things can get unnecessarily heated. But as soon as we brought it on the podcast, everyone was super chill. We had a great exchange. So I'm glad that you thought that it went well, because I had a blast with that one.
Yeah, so you have on Fridays, you release a Philosophy Friday course or lecture or discussion or debate or some sort of conversation that you have on your podcast. And then Sundays, you also have a theology, I forget what you call it. It's Sunday school.
Sunday school.
Yeah, Sunday school.
Right.
And then in between then, you have your fitness and business kind of classes or interviews with other guys. So it's really cool for guys who are all across the spectrum, whether you're Catholic or not Catholic. You appeal to a lot of different guys. So it's awesome.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I call it a generalist podcast. So I try not to be, well, I'm certainly eclectic, but I like to have a sort of overarching theme. And my most recent book came out in 2019, also humbly named How to Be Better at Almost Everything, is all about this idea of generalism and skill stacking. And the idea there is that, and I'm talking largely to entrepreneurs, but I think it universalizes, is that at least in today's world, today's economy, you're going to find a unique set of advantages, not just by going deep, but also going wide, by focusing on building skills in a variety of different areas and then learning to stack and combine those skills to form competitive and creative advantages in life. So specialization, good, fine, but being a generalist, that's the ticket today. So I try to bring that theme on my podcast. So we focus on philosophy, we focus on theology, we focus on fitness. I have the occasional business episode, and I explore other things that are sometimes selfish and just interesting to me. I've been a musician for most of my life, so I sometimes like to talk about that. Writing is obviously another big theme. Virtue. I have to admit, my podcast is largely selfish, as I think some of the most interesting podcasts are. Because if you're not interested in the stuff you're talking about, it's just hard to make good content. I mean, maybe it's just me, but I can almost never sit down in front of a microphone or a blank page and produce anything meaningful unless I'm passionate about it at that moment, at that very moment.
Well, speaking of selfish, I am also someone who's good at almost everything, and so I just feel like we're really connecting right now, Pat. I mean, then your next book should be How to Win at Everything. It's like, because that's essentially, when you're someone like us.
Well, you just compete at all those things that nobody else competes at, right? So in fitness, the key to being a world record holder is you just invent a lift.
Right.
That's the kind of, like the Jefferson lift. Whoever invented the Jefferson lift.
Yeah, this is the blindfolded
that,
deadlift. That's right. It's a totally different thing.
Yeah.
And then you can write the
number
book,
one in the world.
How to Stay Humble in 10 Easy Steps and How I Did It in 3. There you go.
So, Pat, in college, one thing that I learned is that if you could learn 3 songs on an instrument, people just assumed that you had mastered that instrument. And so I would go to a party and there's a harmonica here? Yeah, let me see that thing. You play one song, you play another song, you play another one, and then at that point you can kind of pull the move that's enough. I'm done with the harmonica for right now, and people just think, wow, that guy, he can do anything. And you're right.
Yeah, juice squeeze, right? So that's a lesson I learned as a musician pretty early on, and it is a lesson it took me a long time to learn, because I used to practice the guitar, 8 hours a day. I was obsessive. I wanted to be that
it's a full-time
virtuoso job. Pyrotechnician. Yeah, I mean, I was serious about it. I still play a lot, nowhere near as that much, but that was my obsession. But then, I was in high school, I have my band, we're doing these battle of the bands, and we're losing, consistently losing. And, How to Be Humble in 10 Easy Steps, I was definitely the best guitarist in high school. There's no question about that. But we would lose to the guy who played all the Dave Matthews Band's covers, right? And I'm like, I don't understand, right?
Crash into me.
Right, but to your point, there's this difference between what impresses specialists and what impresses everyday people, right? So what I learned many years later was that, okay, it's cool to be a hardcore specialist. You definitely will impress other guitarists by doing that. But the guy who wins the Battle of the Bands, the guy who impresses people at college parties, if that's what you're into, they don't have to be the best on the fretboard, but if they can do some basic things, but if they can also sing, maybe they can dance a little bit, maybe they can entertain a crowd. It's kind of more of the total package, all the different skills in combination that gets more of the thing that a musician wants, which is just to entertain people, right?
Right.
Than the person like me who is just trying to go deeper and deeper and deeper into just one specific area.
Yeah. And
so there's a deep insight what you brought up. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you can do it with gorgeous biceps, that's just the icing on the cake, you know?
100%.
So,
okay.
Anyway, we're not here to talk about all of the, I mean, as important as these things are.
Right. So we wanted to talk about natural law. I think that natural law is something, so we're going to be talking about we're going to have some philosophical terms today. If you're new to philosophy, this will still be an intro level, so hang in there with us. Don't turn it off yet. Hang in there with us, but because it's very important as Catholic men to understand what natural law is. And before we maybe get going, definitions are a good way to start. Pat, do you want to maybe define what natural law is for maybe somebody who's never heard of that term before?
Sure, and I'll keep things as basic as I can and avoid terminology, unnecessary terminology. But then every time I try and do that, I always find that the terminology is there for a reason. I end up
that you act on some kind of potency that's too high level than what you're supposed to be, or something.
Yeah, you start describing things, and you're like, okay, now I see why they had these terms come in, right?
Right. Terms are important. The point. Important. Yeah.
Right. So, traditional natural law. What is it? Well, it's a great ethical system, right, with links all the way back to those great Greek philosophers of Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics. Comes up, of course, in our wonderful Catholic tradition. St. Thomas Aquinas is often seen as the sort of acme of traditional natural law theory. And then it takes, a big hit in the modern age for various reasons that we can get into. So simply put, traditional natural law, and just a little bit of background. So for your listeners who aren't familiar, I haven't always been Catholic. I was a religious skeptic for many years, but always a student of philosophy, always very interested in philosophy. And I was always deeply disappointed with many modern ethical theories. I always found them grossly inadequate or almost horrendously immoral in some of their consequences, whether it's utilitarianism, consequentialism, pragmatism, whatever. Kantianism or deontology was always fairly attractive, but it never quite did it all the way for me, if that makes sense. And so I stumbled upon traditional natural law, which really is trying to figure out what it means to live a good life. And it grounds what a good life is in the essence of things or the natures of things. So that's where the term natural comes from, natural law. And it's committed to a couple of metaphysical assumptions, which we can spend some time talking about. And the first one is this idea of essentialism. The things of the world really do have an essence or a nature, or to use some Aristotelian terminology, which I promised I wouldn't do, substantial forms. Right?
3 minutes into the conversation.
We're just jumping on. So we'll work through this. And it's all very... Right, it's all very common sense, right? There's such thing as a human nature. There's a such thing as a dog nature, what it means to be a dog. Such thing as an acorn nature, whatever it means to be an acorn. Such thing as an electron nature, whatever it means to be an electron, to have a certain mass, spin, certain inclination to be attracted to protons, right? So I just want to emphasize that we all see the world in a very common sense way, in an essentialist way, right? It's just kind of, putting some technical boundaries and definitions on it, as philosophers do. And to determine what is good for something requires understanding what that something is for. There's almost a functional concept of the good in traditional natural law, right? So one of my professors used to quote one of his professors who would say, if Aristotle were to talk about what a saw is for, well, a saw is for sawing, and it's good when a saw is sawing. Or a saw is most a saw when a saw is sawing. Now, saws are interesting because they're artifacts. We sort of build them and we impose a purpose or a function on them. But we're mostly concerned with things in the natural world, right? Natural kinds, natural essences. Things like human beings, acorns, dogs, cats, things of that sort, and determining what their essence is and what their aims are. And so here's where we'll introduce just another concept quickly, and this is the idea of teleology. So these are the two foundations of natural law, metaphysical foundations. We have essentialism on one hand, that there really are essences, natures in the world, and teleology is a directedness. Those essences or natures are pointed at a particular end, or possibly ends. It could be a certain effect or a range of effects, but they're always, they have natural inclinations, we might say. So stock example might be the acorn. Its natural inclination is always pointed at becoming an oak tree. Now, it might be frustrated, it might be impeded, but acorns never become giraffes spontaneously or lions. They're always reliably becoming oak trees, for example. So it's good when the acorn becomes an oak tree. And trees have natures themselves, right? We say it's good when trees sink deep roots and have strong trunks, and we know what a good tree is based on what a tree is striving or naturally inclined to do. And if a tree is withered and weak and doesn't sink very deep roots, we say that's a bad tree. And we mean that as a matter of objective fact, not opinion. Not that I would prefer my trees to be a different way, but given our inherent grasp of what tree nature is and its natural inclinations, there's no fact value distinction here, and that's what I want to emphasize. And that's something that natural law is capable of doing, in a sense that I don't think any other ethical theories are. Is it can close that fact value gap, because there just is no distinction between fact and value on traditional natural law. To understand the essence of something is to understand what is naturally perfective of it. And so, yeah, so maybe that's just enough to trot out right here at the beginning. I know I said I wouldn't dump too many terms too quickly, but you guys let me talk. So
No. I think that was a great explanation of what it is. So I think when I just think about natural law, it seems to me that is what our culture is. That's what it's missing the most. Just a grasp of reality. Do you agree with that, or do you think there's something more fundamental than, like, is there something that comes first before natural law that maybe
like divine law,
like
divine law would come first?
Well, it comes first in a certain
eternal
order.
Law, yeah,
eternal law, yeah.
But I mean, you don't. The thing is, you don't have to be religious to understand natural law. Natural law is plain. It's in front of us for everyone to see. You know, right. So in some ways, I think actually divine law comes later. Even though its origin is first, if you don't understand natural law, then divine law kind of takes on this. It doesn't make as much sense, you know.
Right. Yeah. You're right. So, like in ontologically speaking, of course, you know, God is before creation, so you know the eternal law is going to be before natural law. But in our order of knowing, we can work through understanding the natural law to get to the eternal law. So it's sort of the reverse there. And I think you're spot on. To your other point, no, you do not have to be religious to affirm natural law. You could be an atheistic Aristotelian. Now, I don't think that's sustainable at the end of the day, because I think you're going to need God to make sense of essentialism and teleology. And in fact, those are the two pillars that Aquinas really uses to launch his fifth way argument for God's existence. But you could superficially just work out a lot of traditional natural law theory without bringing God into the picture at all. So I think God is the underlying necessary support system to ground it at the end of the day. And I think once you affirm these pillars, you're going to have everything you need to make a robust metaphysical argument for God. But you can do all the ethical work without bringing God in at all, really. And I think that should be attractive to people who are secular. Like, we don't need to point to the Bible. We don't need to talk about divine command ethics or anything like that. This is something that somebody who's secular, agnostic, atheist could and should be able to recognize.
Yeah, I mean, I think so too, because ultimately we're just talking about reality, just the way things are. And you look around, you know, with gender theory and all of these ideas that the left just really loves. The only way you could even begin to believe in them is if you have completely divorced yourself from reality, or you were just raised to believe something about the world that's just not true. I mean, obviously something that's not part of natural law.
Right, and there's always, it's one of those things where you can only escape it for so long, on a couple of levels, right? So I want to argue, if without a commitment to natural law, you're not going to have medicine, right? All medicine is committed to there being a norm, right? That there's some norm, some range of what a healthy human being is, right? There's a reason that when somebody is born with clubfoot, we say that there is a defect, something's wrong, something is deviated from the way that a foot should be. So whatever people want to say on Twitter about, against natural law, as soon as they're going to the doctors, that implicit commitment of norms, essences, inclinations is right there, right?
Yeah.
Now, on another level, I think we can be even stronger than this, because if we say that there's no essences, there's no teleology, that everything is a construct of the mind, that's various mental and social construct theories, right? We immediately run into all sorts of problems. One is the mind itself, right? Is the mind a construct of the mind? Because now we're in a sort of vicious circularity, right? Nothing can be the cause of itself. But even think of the teleology of reason, right? We believe that whatever else reason is, it's pointed at or directed towards the attainment of truth. And I think this is a really important point, because if we want to deny teleology, if we want to deny natural inclinations, we're going to have to deny it for reason at the end of the day. But then if we don't have something that reason is naturally directed at, we don't have a standard to determine whether we have reasoned well or reasoned poorly. And as soon as we don't have a standard of reasoning well or reasoning poorly, we don't have a standard for arguments. And once we don't have a standard for arguments, we don't have good or bad arguments. And as soon as we don't have good or bad arguments, we have no arguments against traditional natural law. So there's a sort of number of reductios that we can run to show that I don't think you can ever escape this on a performative level with the way you live your life, and I don't think you can ever escape it even on a philosophical level. You're kind of, at the end of the day, you're going to be committed to this, so you might as well just try and get it right.
Well, Pat, I mean, that might be true for you, but I mean, that's just not true for me.
Right. That's your truth, man.
Right. Your truth. Right.
And is that objectively true for all of us, that that's just my truth?
Right. Exactly. Right.
Yeah, that's a vicious circle.
Yeah, you might think that that's your truth, but for me, that isn't your truth, because for me, you have a different truth.
Yeah. That's the craziness that you
I've
get
said
into.
it before. Your truth is one of my biggest pet peeves in the world. It's like the who caused God objection. I know that it agitates a lot of people because it's so kindergartenish, but I think the your truth probably agitates me even more.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so so natural. I mean, when you think about it, like if you understand what something is for, then you can understand what is good for it and what is bad for it. And for a man, especially for a Catholic man, if you understand like what you're made for, then you can understand that virtue is good for you and vices are not good for you, and you can understand how to live your life in accordance to the Christian life that we're called to live. That is why natural law is so important. But I think that a lot of guys don't just stop. They have these aha moments or like these campfire moments where they realize, well, what am I made for? What am I doing here? And
what's the meaning of life?
What's the meaning of life? And they don't realize, they don't stop and think, okay, why am I made? Who made me? What am I here for? And what's good for me and what's not good for me? And I think everybody, if they just had like a Introduction to Natural Law 101 or something like that in high school, that would solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, I agree. My first ethics class, undergrad ethics class, was actually taught by a strong form moral relativist, like a legit your truth person. They're out there even in the academy. Now, I think
how do you teach ethics?
What's that?
How does that person teach ethics?
Well,
seems like the worst thing for them to be teaching.
It is important, I think, for people to realize that most ethicists are moral realists. So relativism seems to be much more popular in pop culture than it is among professional philosophers, but they do exist. They are there. And one of the conversations we had, of course, I was agitated in class, and I was pushing back against her and this theory, and we were going back and forth, and at one point she so let me set the stage a little bit, right? So she just got done saying that she believes that because all morals are relative, you should never impose your values on anybody. You should never instruct, criticize, praise, blame, condemn, etc. Right? Now, of course, notice like the oughtness of her statements, right? She's already making moral statements after she just said this is exactly what you shouldn't do. So you have an immediate performance contradiction, right? So of course I'm agitated by this. I'm like you have your PhD. And like these poor children. Think of the children, right? Like a lot of people in an undergrad ethics class, like they're not that interested. Like they're just, this is their elective, but like it seeps in, you know? So like it annoys me as somebody who's like really interested in philosophy. Like, okay, like you might be able to dump this on like 9 out of every 10 of your students, and who knows how it's going to affect them down the line. I think it's a hideous thing to do. So she starts pushing back on me. And she says, you know, Pat, I think maybe you should, you know, quiet down. And she said it a little gentler in that, and maybe give some of the other students time to speak. So I said, well, why? My values are speaking up in class. That's what
nice.
I value.
Well played.
That's my truth, right? And she says, well, maybe if you took the time to think about it, you would value other people's opinion. I said, no, I have thought about it, and my values are what I think.
I've already thought about that actually, and I don't.
Like, these are my values and my truth. All right, so she knows what I'm doing, and she's getting agitated. And this is like you think this was out of a cartoon. This legit happened. One of my friends was actually outside in the hallway monitoring this and laughing the whole time. And so I eventually let it go. I go up after class and we have this chat. And I say to her, like, look, I'm really not trying to be a pain, right? Like, I just think that this is just a batty worldview. And weirdly enough, we go deeper into the conversation. It turns out she herself is a Christian. She's a Christian. And she believes this stuff. I don't think she was Catholic. We didn't get that deep about it. But that really shocked me, that somebody who was even brought up or maintained a Christian faith could promote such a relativistic worldview like that. Yeah. So it just goes to show how deep it can run. Mm-hmm.
Because in order to believe that, you have to believe that no truth exists. There is no truth outside of yourself. That truth is just there for you to define, and that there's nothing real. I mean, you really even have to say that there's nothing real outside of yourself. You know, that tree that everybody sees, it's not even really there. It's kind of a coincidence that we all agree that there's a tree in this one spot. I mean, like, if you just reduce it to what it really is, that's what you end up having to do. You know, you have to deny everything. The world doesn't even exist. You don't exist. I mean, because there's nothing real outside of you.
Yeah, there are different schools and of relativism, if you will. So there is that very, very strong form of relativism, that there is just no objective truth relativism, right? And the immediate issue with that is that they're claiming that as an objective truth, right?
Yeah, is that absolutely true? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, just saws off the proverbial branch that they're sitting on. A number of philosophers have realized that that's problematic, so they might take a more modest position and say, okay, well, maybe there's some truths out there, whatever they are, maybe mathematical truths or logical truths or truths of, certain facts of the natural world, but relative morals are completely relative. So they'll kind of just bring relativism just into the moral realm itself. I don't know with my previous professor, she was definitely a strong form moral relativist. My inclination is to think she probably would have gone further than that, but I just never got a chance to chat with her about it. So there's kind of degrees of relativism out there.
Okay, so how would you like? I think a lot of guys have experienced that, like the moral relativist at work or wherever, and it's my truth, not your truth, or whatever. How would you go about answering that or combating that if you were in that position?
Right. So if they're taking the strongest form of relativism, I think it's just a 2-second refutation. I honestly don't think you need to go much further than that. It's just so patently false, right? If it's true, it's false. If it's not true, we don't need to pay attention to it, right? It's just a self-defeating position. If they want to bring it down to just morality, it gets a little more complicated, but I don't think it's that difficult to defeat. I would say something like this, right? That we seem to have a whole suite of cognitive powers, right? We have reasoning powers, we have powers of sight, physical senses, stuff like that. But we also have a moral power. And this moral power seems to tell us something that we at least perceive as being very true about the world. Like when there's certain actions that happen that we really perceive as being truly and utterly wrong. Actions like rape, the Holocaust, I mean, you name it. So one thing to do is just draw out the consequences that almost nobody would want to accept. Like, do you really want to say that there was nothing wrong about slavery? It was just a different culture or something like that. Do you really want to say that there's nothing wrong about torturing and raping a young child and then killing that child? Is that really what are you really willing to bite that bullet? Thankfully, most people aren't, right? But if they do bite the bullet,
yeah, you go to the extreme in hopes that they don't bite the bullet.
But if they do bite the bullet, I would say that there's a sort of package deal with our cognitive powers, right? That you can't break one cognitive power without casting doubt on all the cognitive powers. There's no reason to think that our moral power would be so utterly diluted as to just present to us aspects of reality that are completely false. There's no argument against that wouldn't also apply to a reasoning power, for example, right? And so as soon as you try to damage or strike down our moral power, you're going to take down our reasoning power with it. And as soon as you do that, you're then going to have no arguments against the moral power either. So we're kind of back to another reductio against the moral relativist position, that our cognitive powers, our human powers, are something of a package deal. They're either going to be generally reliable. Doesn't mean they're infallible. Obviously, you can make mistakes, but general reliability, they really do tell us something about the world, or we're going to have to accept a position of unsustainable, self-defeating skepticism, I would say.
So, Pat, I think that in the realm of morals, most people, 99.9%, however many nines you want to put at the end of that number, of people are going to say, yeah, murder is wrong. All of those terrible things that you just mentioned, those are obviously morally wrong. The question, the area of debate really comes down to the area of sexuality. Okay? And so I think natural law,
it always boils down to.
It always comes down to sex.
I know, I get it. It's authority first, but then like right after authority, it is always about the sexual ethics.
Sure. But I think that natural law is the exact place to approach this argument, because it's, comes down to the rest of your body parts. What are they for? Your eyes are for seeing, your nose is for smelling and breathing. I like to use the example that if I just said, well, I am going to start tasting my food with my eyes. I mean, that's just what I'm going to do with my body. And people would say, no, don't do that. That's bad for your eyes. Like, oh, who are you to say what's good and bad for, it's like, so here I am eating my chips and salsa, with my eyes. And obviously, I mean, there's like going to be natural consequences that are be swift. But as soon as we get below the belt, and everyone would agree with that your ears are for hearing, your nose is for smelling, your eyes are for seeing. But like then you get below the belt and people take that same logic and they throw it out the window. And they say like, oh, I probably do anything I want with this. This probably, this is free range down here. So what would you say to, I mean, I think that's so common, that like, oh yeah, right. That's your choice. How do we address that?
So it really depends where the person is coming from. So let me say a couple things. One, natural law is once you affirm it, there's almost no escaping a traditional morality. So let me say that, because we have these natural powers. These natural powers are aimed towards a natural end, which are good for us, right? So it's always going to be just a matter of metaphysical necessity that if we intentionally frustrate a natural power away from its natural end, it's always going to be bad for us. That's going to include the power of speech, right? This is why we say lying is bad. Lying is immoral. Speech is a natural power aimed at getting what is in my head out through my mouth and hopefully to somebody else, communicating truth, or at least sincerity, right? Maybe I'm wrong, but I have an obligation to communicate what is really in my head and not pervert that, all right? We have powers of nutrient assimilation, If I decide to become bulimic and intentionally frustrate that power, it's bad for me, and people recognize that. People recognize that bulimia is bad. But you're right; they seem to, and so far most people would agree with this. Yeah, most people understand that lying is bad. I don't think they understand how bad it is, and I think they're willing to make too many exceptions, like all lying is bad. But they suddenly, yeah, once you get below the belt, it's like people don't know what that stuff is for, right anymore. We all know what it's for, right? And hopefully we don't need to do a class here.
You have boy parts and you have girl parts,
right?
Yeah,
and they work together. Yeah.
Right. So, part of it is people kind of want to base things on consent, right? This is kind of a modern view. Well, it's two consenting adults or this or that. The problem with consent-based ethics is it at best begs the question, right? So if I said, you know what, I consent for one of you to go into my neighbor's house and steal all this stuff, people be like, well, hold on a minute. You can't consent to that because you don't have the power to
you don't have the authority to do that.
Right.
Right. So people just assume that you have the power to consent to your own harm. And the natural law theorist would say no. That at best begs the question, right? Consent isn't some magic wand that we can just wave and say, I consent. Whoosh. And now it's a good act, right? No, clearly not, right? By other circumstances, we would say, no, you can't just consent to that because you don't have the power to do that, right? Consent only applies when you already have the power to do something, and something is already within your power, and it's already morally permissible for you to do that. So if certain acts that you do either to yourself or with other people who are willing to do those acts are under question for their moral permissibility, it's not enough just to say that it's two consenting adults, because that's exactly what's under question. So that's what I would at least bring up to a lot of people at first, because that seems to be the common line, that if you're consenting either with yourself or other people, that it's okay because you're consenting. And I would say, well, that's at best question begging, because you might not actually have the power to consent to that, or at least it wouldn't be morally permissible even if you thought it was. And we can think of examples, right? Just if somebody wanted to consent to cut off their own arm, most of us would hopefully want to stop that person and say, no, that's really bad for you. You actually don't have moral permissibility to do that, because you never have moral permissibility to intentionally harm yourself in any way.
Because that's not what your arm is for.
Right, and that's why we even have like people in the police that help people try suicide watch. If somebody's trying to jump off the bridge, we're like, no, don't do that. That's not good for you, and we try to talk them down and try to get them off the bridge. There's a purpose for that. It's not like we're just saying like, "Yep, go ahead. It's no big deal."
Yeah,
I mean, there's a reason for having those.
Yeah, but just getting. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, you finish your thought, and then I'll hop in. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh well, I was just going to say, this is kind of the whole missing piece, is just this fundamental understanding of who the human person is. What are we for? We're made up of all of these different parts, each are for four different things, and you have to understand all of this. I mean, really, sometimes I feel, I was kind of joking about it earlier, like, well, some people have boy parts and some people have girl parts, but sometimes I really feel like I have to say that to people, that
you have to start there.
Like, I shouldn't have to say this to you, but based on the thing that you just said, I feel like I do have to say it to you, and please don't be offended, but like, you obviously don't understand this, and they're for each other, right? I don't know. It's baffling.
Yes, it certainly is. But sometimes you have to just take it right back to basics. And let's be honest. One of the interesting things about I'm hesitant to do this because the nice thing about natural law is you don't have to bring in religion. Not that I think there's anything wrong with that, but I mean, one of the things that has come out of Fatima is the possibility that a lot of people who are led away from God are led away from God because of sexual sins. That this is a serious issue. Now, people think, of course, murder and whatever are horrible, but the problem with sexual sins is they're just so common, right? They're just so easy to fall into, that these are the things that we should, like, most of us hopefully probably don't really have to worry about becoming murderers in our lives, right? But I think pretty much all of us, certainly me, for most of my life, I was deep in sexual sin, right? I mean, and this was something I really had to work out as I was becoming Catholic and realizing, because I had a completely liberal sexual ethic, right? I was one of those total libertarians with sexuality. It's like, hey, you consent, then anything goes, right? So this was something I completely changed my mind on and had to change my mind on, and I'm glad I did. I am better off for it. And it's one of those things, sort of practical wisdom that, you can maybe understand the arguments of it, but I don't know if you'll ever really get it unless you try to live it and experience the benefits of that. And I would say that just goes for the virtuous life in general. But yeah, this is something that I had to change my entire lifestyle over. Even my marriage, right? I was with my wife. We were not Catholic. We were married before we were Catholic, so we had to, conform to the natural law, to the teachings of the church on all this.
Yeah, Pat, I think you're so right that, especially for men, the sexuality the sexual aspect of morality is something that almost all men struggle with, but men will never experience freedom until they have learned mastery of themselves in this way. If you have not mastered your sexual powers, then you will never be free. Right. I mean, as a man, because we have so many powers, and but that one is so fundamental, so essential to our being. You know what I mean? That if
doesn't Aquinas talk about this because it's so powerful, that it's the concupiscible appetite is so strong and so vivid and so visual and so strong within man that is the one that is the toughest to overcome or to conquer. Is that right, Pat? I may be wrong there. I'm amateur at
generally,
best.
I don't have the exact quote off of my head, but I mean, it's obviously true, right? I mean, and it's funny, but what you bring up about men, because most men these days, they are very much attracted to virtue ethics when you trot it out. I know, because I talk about it on my podcast a lot, and I have a lot of men who are into fitness, right? And they're like, oh yeah, self-mastery, rah, heck yeah, right? Like, I can discipline myself with dieting. I can discipline myself with lifting weights. But my sexual powers. Oh man, right? It's like it's the disconnect is amazing, right? It's like either you want self-mastery or you don't. Either you want to be free in the Catholic sense, which is freedom for excellence. And this comes, right in line with traditional natural law, that true freedom is disciplining the desires to make the good life at first accessible and then effortless. Disciplining the desires to make the good life at first accessible and then effortless. People get this with nutrition, the good life of health, right? Physical, bodily health, fitness, all that stuff. But what is an appetite that if we don't try to rein it in, we don't try to keep it in its proper place, and we're not talking about being prudes, right? Catholics have a very healthy and robust view of sexuality. It's just in its proper proportion, in its proper place, a monogamous marital relationship. That is the thing that will make you utterly a slave, right? And we just think of just not the general promiscuity, but the widespread addiction to pornography that is exceedingly psychologically damaging. It supports an industry that is utterly depraved, abusive. So yeah, I mean, I just want to emphasize that, like, men, you should be attracted to self-mastery because that's what true freedom is. But that is going to involve not just fixing your diet, not just getting on an exercise program, but the whole self, and that includes the sexual powers as well.
Pat, do you think many men pursue physical and dietary mastery in order to pursue the way that they're already enslaved by their sexual powers? I mean, do you think that has? I mean, you would know more than me.
Yeah, this is something. I mean, let's be frank, right? I mean, that's why did I start working out when I was 18?
Right.
Well, it started for two reasons, right? One is I kind of grew up the chubby, overweight kid, so I wasn't like totally bullied. I had a lot of friends, but I was picked on a lot, and it bothered me. So that was one motivation. But then you get a taste of it, and you don't have a lot of virtue, and you kind of start just doing the right things for the wrong reasons, right? We're all familiar with that, and that itself is a vice. So you do it, you work out not because you want to discipline your desires, and you want to have an ascetic practice, and you want to be a good role model for your kids, and you want to keep the body healthy, but because you want to show off, you want to be vain, you want to be prideful. So, I mean, intentions are so critical, and they are a big part of natural law theory, right? So we do look at outcomes as well, but we also focus on intentions. So this is something I like to talk about a lot in fitness, is like fitness itself. It can be used toward virtue, or it can be used toward vice, depending a lot on your intentions. You can have the exact same outcome, right? But depending on why you're striving for that outcome can either cause you to flourish and be a more virtuous person, or cause you to cave more in on yourself, become more narcissistic, more obsessive, and ultimately more dissatisfied in the long term, especially as you get older and you don't perform as well and you don't look as well. And that's a real trap. That's something I see in the fitness industry all the time. People develop all sorts of eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders with exercise. They never feel like they're keeping up with the next guy or the next lady. And it's no wonder, because they started with intentions that weren't oriented towards virtue, as I did. So my intentions now of why I work out are radically different than, when I was in my late teens, early 20s.
Okay, so that brings a good question. Like, if you read the Stoics, if you read, Cicero or Marcus Aurelius, other Stoics, they all talk about self-mastery. They talk about denying yourself. They talk about, making sure that you're lifting weights, that you're denying all the concupiscible and irascible appetites you have under control. How does that play into the Christian life? Because it seems like at times that the Stoics do it just for the sake of pain, or the sake of loss. I don't know how to articulate this that well. I haven't thought about this enough, but it just seems like that if you read the Stoics, you seem like, okay, they're doing it just for the sake of denying themselves, which is fun, which is a good habit, I guess, to follow. But how does that play into the Christian life? Because it seems like sometimes the Stoics, you're doing it for just the sake of the denial, but for the Christian life, there's the sacrificial love, there's the sacrificial giving that you have when denying yourself. Does this make sense? I'm sorry, I haven't really thought this through. I'm just trying to walk this through myself.
Right. So yeah, what's an issue with the Stoic approach? Well, sometimes it takes intentions a little too far. It makes it seem like it's just your intentions that matter in life. And actually, Aristotle offers the correction to this. He's like, yeah, obviously intentions matter, but there are external factors that matter as well, which is why he adds that a good life should have, say, also a modicum or a moderate amount of wealth, right? For example, because it's hard to develop virtue when you're literally starving to death, right? So there's certain sort of just basic material needs that realistically need to be met to have a good life as well. So Aristotle offers something of a correction there. Christianity is very interesting and different because in one sense it's very much the same, in another sense it's radically different, because we have the theological virtues and we have a much more robust understanding of God's causality, that everything good first and ultimately comes from God. So if you focus too much on Stoicism, you might fall into Pelagianism, for example, right? Yeah. So the Christian life, the Catholic life, is first understanding that it's grace first, right? I can never merit any goodness on my own, right? At most, I can only demerit on my own. I can only resist the Spirit's call. I can only place an impediment to the grace of God working within me. So, once we're sort of infused with the virtues, and Aquinas thinks that the virtues are infused all at once, which surprises people. Of course, they can be, I don't want to say in competition with, but we can still have vices that we've ingrained over a long time that takes time to undo that, right? Because, and this is important, virtues are good habits, right? That's what virtues are. I don't know if we define that yet. And vices are bad habits. So good habits are habits that tend us towards our thriving and our flourishing. Vices are habits that tend us away from it. Just to get a quick definition out there. So yeah, so I think Aristotle might offer one of the corrections to the Stoics that I think you were hinting at, Adam. And then the Christian life just needs to consider God's universal causality, right, in the line of the good, that we can really only do one thing and one thing by ourselves, which is introduce nothingness into reality or absurdity into reality. We can fail to do what we otherwise could have done under the impulse of God, right? We can fail to consider the moral rule in certain situations, and then we can make a judgment or perform an act where the moral rule should have applied, and then we have an action that is missing something. It's missing a consideration of the moral rule. So we have a privation of being, which is, this is an evil. That's what an evil is a privation. And that is on us. That's the only thing where we are the first cause of is nothingness. And we can be the first cause of it precisely because it's nothing. It's an absurdity. It's something that's missing that should have been there. But anything good, anything positive, always and first comes from God. So I would say we just need to make those theological nuances, which are very important, but it also has practical implications, because what does that mean? It means we should always be going to God, never be resisting or trying to put an impediment to God working within us, God transforming us as Catholic men, praying that God continues to give us the grace to live the virtuous life, and understanding it's not something that we can just pull ourselves up by our metaphysical bootstraps and get done. It needs to be something that is a matter of cooperation with the grace that God is giving us.
But don't you think it's also about not just like the suffering for the suffering's sake, but the redemptive suffering that takes the Christian life? If you take, there's parts of the Stoicism that's good, that you denying yourself, but not denying yourself for that sake, but denying yourself maybe for a greater good in cooperation with our Lord, maybe for a particular grace for your wife or your children or yourself, or for our country, or for whatever X, Y, or Z. Don't you think that wouldn't that be the separation of the Stoicism versus the Christian life?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and I think it is, right? So suffering takes on a whole new meaning and purpose with Christianity. You mentioned it for redemptive purposes, right? Suffering in love, self-sacrificial suffering, the old Catholic cliche of offering it up, which is a very real thing. And we also would hold, Eleanor Stump is great on this, that God, in our post-fall human condition for rational beings, God will allow suffering if and only if it delivers an outweighing benefit primarily for the individual. So suffering can be seen as, and this is very, very early in the Christian tradition. In fact, St. Paul makes this very well known, right? That suffering in an interesting and paradoxical way is a sign of being loved, especially by God, right? Mm-hmm. That there's certain gifts that suffering brings that we don't always fully quite understand it. I think we can look back at certain aspects of our life very often and see, I see how that suffering brought about some really greater good. But I think there's other connections that we'll only be able to see in the hereafter of how our redemptive and self-sacrificial suffering helped others as well. But it's also about conforming wills, love, right? Love, unity requires two wills freely coming together. And suffering can help do that. Suffering can break down our egoism. It can break down our superficiality. It can cause us to be more empathetic, more compassionate, and seek greater union with other people, to realize that we are radically dependent. We are not independent, which pushes us more into our social nature. We're not just rational animals, but we're rational, dependent, social, political animals, right? So suffering can serve all these therapeutic purposes, if you will, and Christianity understands this, I think, obviously far better than Stoicism does. I think Stoicism, and this is the general Catholic posture towards many different philosophies and belief systems, right? It can recognize, there's something good there's something right there, but it's a little bit off here or it's incomplete there. And I think your note about suffering is spot on. Suffering takes on a much more transformative, beautiful and loving meaning in Christianity that it seems to somewhat lack. It's a little stale, a little cold in a lot of the Stoics.
But that's why it's so popular in a lot of other even fitness or business, realms. That's why Jocko is really big. That's why all these other guys are really big, because they're teaching denying themselves. They're teaching to say no to your appetites. So that way you can say yes to the greater goods of different things. And that's why I think it's just so interesting. They're so close to the Christian life and in the understanding.
But it's an overreaction. I mean, ultimately the Stoic has to say you're utterly depraved, and suffering is like what you deserve. You deserve to suffer because you're, this is what you are. you're just bad, so you should be suffering. And I get why people are attracted to that, because if someone has pursued their appetites their whole life and given themselves all of these good things, and it has not satisfied you, you say, well, maybe I deserve bad things. Maybe and not that suffering is bad in and of itself. I mean, it is kind of natural. Suffering is on a natural level is bad. We were not made for suffering originally. But I do understand why you might flip the other way, but it's an overreaction to, I have given myself everything I wanted all the time, and that didn't work. So maybe I'll deny myself everything I want all the time to see if that works. It just...
Yeah, what do you say to
But
that?
it's not the virtue.
What do you say to that, Pat?
Yeah, I want to first caution a couple things, because people might take this the wrong way. I don't want to do that. Like, suffering is bad, right? Like, you're spot on. So sometimes people might hear what I've said and they might say, oh, great, I should go cause people to suffer. And no, that would be a wicked and evil thing to do, right? Just because God might permit suffering,
right,
because it might be the best or only available means to deliver some outweighing benefit, doesn't mean that alleviates us of our moral obligation to alleviate
it.
Suffering,
can be redeemed.
Right?
It can be redeemed. Right. Exactly.
Right. It can be redeemed. And it doesn't take away the badness of people who are truly suffering. Right. So you don't want to be tone deaf and go into somebody who's like suffering from chemotherapy and say,
God, you are real lucky. Lucky you.
Right. Yeah. Blessed be you. Now, like, it might be true, right? We know people who, with great grace, and have suffered huge physical and mental impairments, their lives still thrive as a whole person, right? Which goes to show that we're more than just the physical or mental. We're a whole person, because you can be really not thriving physically and mentally and still thrive and flourish and have a hugely good, virtuous life as a whole person, right? So I think that's something interesting to keep in mind. And it's something that's kind of overlooked, I think, by maybe the Jocko crowd, where they maybe focus a lot on the physical and mental, but they overlook the whole person. Not entirely, right? But I just would want to say you could still thrive hugely, and we have examples through history of really great heroes and saints who suffered physically, mentally, sometimes both, in immense ways, and are people we hugely admire and esteem, and say as a person they flourish more than almost anybody I can think of.
Which is heroic, which is why we look up to them, because it's heroic the way they do it. Yeah.
It's worthy of replication.
Yes.
Yeah, you said something else too, but I totally forgot what it was.
I said, well, when you take that suffering and you unify it to the cross, that's heroic, which is why we look up to it.
Right. Yeah. Before that, there was something else about the nature of suffering. So, I wanted to emphasize. Yeah.
I was just saying that, suffering is bad, but then the Stoics, they kind of think, I must be bad, so I deserve to suffer, and then people today might overreact and go back instead of.
It is funny. It is funny that now fasting is such a big deal. Intermittent fasting is such a big thing. These CrossFit.
But to be fair, I think intermittent fasting is popular because it works. As a diet, it's very effective and it's easier to do. You know what I mean? So I think that's why it's popular.
But the Catholic faith has always said, you should be fasting.
Sure.
Because it works not only on a natural, only on a natural level, but on a spiritual level as well.
Catholic fasting though isn't necessarily going to help you lose weight. I mean, depends on how you do it.
I don't know. For me, I always drop some pounds.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, the best I've looked as an adult was coming off of Exodus 90 last year. I mean, hands down. You guys should have seen me. Okay, it was incredible.
Yeah, it depends if you're doing like those medieval black fasts or not, right?
Yeah.
So fasting is a really good example, especially in the fitness world and nutrition world. Fasting people are typically not fasting these days because they want to develop ascetic disciplines and grow in virtue. They just want to lose 10 pounds, right?
Right.
And it's funny. I was talking with Brian about this on the episode that we did, one of the episodes we did, because people can develop, it might seem like a good habit, say with discipline around their diet, but it's actually a vicious habit. It becomes an obsession, right? You think of the person who can never enjoy a dessert with their wife or kids because they're so obsessed about their macro intake or something like that. Well, the difficult thing, the ascetic practice for them at that point is not to just keep eating their small side of sweet potato and baked salmon, but to have the ice cream cone, right? That's the difficult thing to do. That's what the appropriate challenge for that person would be. So
but that's where the
context
virtue
in-
is, right? That's where the virtue. It's in the middle. It's not one. Virtue is never an extreme, right? It's always in the middle.
Right. So this is Aristotle's famous golden mean. That the virtue is that sort of the sweet spot between excess and deficiency, right? So the classic example would be courage. Courage is what lies between the excess of recklessness, of just foolishly rushing into a dangerous situation because maybe you like the thrill of it, and the deficiency of cowardice, of never taking up a challenge or never putting yourself in a dangerous situation even when you know it is the right thing to do. Virtue is something that's the cardinal virtues are prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. And prudence is the chariot virtue, right? This is practical good reasoning, and this helps us to cart the virtues around and understand how and when and where to apply them, how to do specifically the right thing in the right circumstances to the right person at the right time. That's what virtue, which sounds like a really nice way of saying nothing, right? But that's why prudence is so important, because circumstances and intentions and all these things vary. There's like an infinite number of situations we can find ourselves in. So prudence is that habit of good practical moral reasoning where you're just automatically effective, right, at just knowing what the right thing to do is, and a lot of that is gained through experience of finding virtuous people, imitating them. The Catholic saints are, of course, great models. It's not enough just to read Nicomachean Ethics, for example, right? It's not just getting words into your head. It's something that really needs to be lived, practiced, imitated.
Dang. I was really hoping that would be enough.
Although the commentary of Aquinas on Aristotle's ethics could be enough.
Okay, so Pat, let me ask you this question. I've actually never thought about this before, so it just came.
So it's gonna be dumb.
Just thought about this. So if you asked me this question, I'm not sure what I'd say, but I'm gonna ask it to you. Well, we're talking about fasting. Fasting seems to be contrary to the natural law. That it even seems like it could be contrary to virtue. If virtue is like this exact middle, like the golden mean, not too much food, not too little. Obviously, if you were to live your whole life, like on days that we fast, if we were to live our whole lives on that much food, we'd fail to flourish to our fullest capacity. It's not like you'd probably live for a long time, but you wouldn't be physically flourishing. So how is fasting morally acceptable?
Yeah, well, when it comes to certain powers, right, it's important to understand that some are episodic, some are not episodic, right? So our sexual power is episodic. We have an episode, right? There's a clear climax and like target, if you will.
A start and a finish.
Again, I don't think we need a class on this, right? Other powers, hair growth, perspiration, they're sort of continuous, et cetera, stuff like that. Eating, nutrient assimilation is not something that nature is designed for us to do all the time, right? And in fact, we know if somebody is doing that all the time, that they are suffering from gluttony. There's something seriously wrong there. And breaking from eating not only is something that nature has equipped us for and seemed to give us all the mechanisms to deal with, but we actually benefit from it. And that's where the contemporary research of intermittent fasting is really fascinating. And this is something that I was interested in long before I was Catholic, right? My second book that I ever wrote is called Fast Diets for Dummies. I was a For Dummies author for a while. And this is a number of years old now. There's been more good research that comes out. But we find that fasting is actually really, really good for us. It contributes to our flourishing, our health, right? That there's cellular regeneration, that fasting can reduce inflammation. There's health benefits to fasting that I think this is published in Cell Metabolism not too long ago, that are irrespective of weight loss, which itself is really fascinating, because a lot of times for a while the hypothesis was, well, yeah, fasting's good for you, but it's just because it gets you to lose weight. But now there's strong evidence to suggest no, fasting by itself seems to have health benefits that are independent of the weight loss that it may occur. So I would say they're the seedings of the answer for you, that we're not by nature meant to eat all the time, that abstaining from a power is different from perverting the faculty, right? So I have the faculty to eat. I can abstain from that from no moral fault. However, if I start to eat and then I throw up, bulimia, that's the perversion of it, right? So just in the same sense, I'm not under an obligation to talk all the time. When I do talk, I better talk straight. I better not lie. There's a similar parallel there with fasting and bulimia. Fine to abstain from the power. Now, there's a threshold, right? There's a threshold that once you reach that, it would become immoral, whatever that is. And that might be largely an empirical question at some point, where you really start to do serious damage to yourself and like starve yourself and whatever. So that's certainly right? Just with because now we're, moving from what would be the excess of gluttony to some extreme deficiency, in a sense there.
Right.
But yeah, intermittent fasting, occasional fasts, even extended fasts, right? The human body can seem to thrive significantly even off of extended fasts. They're difficult. I don't know if they're always necessary. Most of the health benefits for fasting seem to occur within the first 16 to 24, maybe 32 hours, stuff like that. But yeah, I think that
was a great answer. It does strike me that most of our powers, if you want to say, do benefit from being strained. Our physical powers are certain that way. Our mental powers are that way. If we never push them, if we never strain them, then they don't ever grow, and they start to slacken. Also, I think that many people suffer from the misinterpretation of the golden mean as if it's a static, straight line. And that I don't believe to be the case. I believe that the golden mean is more of a cyclical back and forth. Many things in life are cyclical. Almost everything in life is cyclical. And so I think, obviously, there are some virtues like charity where the golden mean is as much as possible all the time. I mean, you can't love too much. There is no, there's no moderation in charity. So not all of the virtues have a excess and a diminishment.
Right, and that's and I would say for that, you're just going all in on the golden mean, right? And that's what you want to do. Whereas take like generosity, right? Like there's vices that are extend from that, right? One is just being stingy, but the other one is just giving away a whole bunch of stuff just to be showy about it, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to do that, right?
You don't want your kids starving because you gave everything away to somebody else. It's like you have to feed your kids.
That would be imprudent, right? You're not fulfilling your proximate obligations that you have to your family before you fill more remote obligations, for example. So there's sort of proximity in moral relationships that is important as well in traditional natural law. And to your and the golden mean, it's important, at least for Aristotle, is it can actually be closer to one side or the other, right? I think like most people probably recognize that courage is probably closer to recklessness than it is cowardice, for example. There's nuances and subtleties there, but those are probably distinctions and technicalities we don't necessarily need to worry about for this episode.
Pat, what are you reading right now? I'm curious on what you're studying.
Yeah, I'm on a big kick. I'm gonna try and solve this whole predestination issue. So that's the project right now.
Oh, is that all? Is that all you're doing?
Yeah, that's the.
Are you solving predestination or double predestination?
Yeah, so definitely trying to avoid Calvinism, right?
And, good.
Yeah, which we want to do, right? But the predestination, I love the predestination question. I think I've come to a satisfying, position myself on it. I'm just thinking about, maybe doing some written work on it now at this point, especially in relation to Mary, who I think figures into that very interestingly. But for people who aren't familiar, double predestination, arbitrary election, stuff like that, definitely want to avoid that if we want to preserve divine innocence. But the other thing we want to make sure we're careful with preserving in predestination is divine sovereignty, aseity, divine universal causality. So I love predestination because it's one of those areas that's so thorny and knotty because you have to consider so many different things at once. and you're off, even if you're off a little bit in one area, you're going to have to make adjustments in all the other areas. So it's an extremely delicate and difficult project. I mean, you have to deal with metaphysics, philosophical anthropology, relationship between grace and freedom. You have to handle scripture. You have to handle tradition. So it's just, it fascinates me. It's fascinated me for a long time. And there's a lot that rides on it, right? It's a big question.
Yeah.
It's a significant one.
Yeah, that's one of those areas where you say, thank God for the church. Because most people are not going to delve into this with both hands. Like, it sounds like you are. And you can just say, like, this is what the church teaches on this. And, like, great. I know that this is trustworthy, and I know I can believe this. And it's so merciful and lovely.
Right. God offers sufficient grace. I can resist interior grace. We affirm divine universal causality. We also affirm human freedom. And for a lot of people, that's great. And you're good to go. Maybe that's all you need. Me, I just want to figure out how all of it works, right?
Yeah. And he wants all men to be saved.
Yes, I do. I would love that. I think everybody should want all to be saved.
Well,
right?
you and God. Yeah.
Yeah. God wills that all may be saved, but He
knows that not all of them will.
But maybe not all of them are. So what goes on there? Can God be frustrated? That's an important question, right? Can God be frustrated in a particular sense?
Yeah.
And we don't need to go into that now, but that's something maybe for people to think about.
Well, hey, I would love to have you back on again if you're willing, because I think this conversation only opened up probably 8 more questions that I'd love to dive into at some point. And maybe we can continue talking, and maybe even have another, like, have our buddy Thomas Lackey join us at some point, and we can have kind of a round table discussion as Pat Flynn has
I did just
before.
get one question from Juan.
Oh, okay.
And this could be maybe a good one to end on, because this is maybe the finale question. It's gonna be the hardest question because I don't really know what it means. But he says, how to use natural law as a guide to prioritize proximate ends in the search of the fulfillment for final ends.
Ooh, so our final end is God, right? And maybe for men, we could focus on family here and our wives and our children, because those are a proximate obligation, but they're gifts that God gave us to grow in charity and love. So the priority is important, right? Because we look to God to give us the grace to be good fathers, to be good husbands, right? But God gives us our wives and our children's so we can grow in love and self-sacrifice, which is itself, of course, the pathway to heaven. So there's sort of a mutual, I think, back and forth there. It's the great Catholic both and, right? So you got to keep your focus on that ultimate end, which is God, which will empower you in your proximate ends, which will continue to conform you and prepare you for that ultimate end.
That was brilliant. And when I held up my fists there, that wasn't me like wanting to fight you. That was me both and. I was taking them both in my different hands, just so you know, like I wasn't being...
You weren't throwing up the door.
I saw myself on the camera doing it.
It was like, what are you, the fire?
That did not...
Fighting Irishman?
Yeah, it did not come off.
Stand.
Right. Yeah. Which, it's like my shirt, I have a boxing shirt on.
You're not calling him out. We know that.
It just didn't come off the way I thought it was going to. Anyway.
Hey, so what we're going to do, Pat, is we're going to link all of your books and your podcast and everything for everybody on our show notes, so you can go to thecatholicmanshow.com, and all of the stuff that we've talked about this evening, you can follow up with all the stuff that Pat is doing on his show, chroniclesofstrength.com. You can go to his website and check out all of his stuff there. That is where the Pat Flynn resides.
In the
interwebs.
Often imitated.
Yes, which is a good form of flattery.
Absolutely.
But Pat, thanks so much for hanging out with us this evening, man. I really appreciate it. I hope you can come back and we can talk more.
You've been listening to the Catholic Man
I would
Show.
love to.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was just...
He was getting excited.
I know. I was excited there.
It's all good. This has been an absolute blast, guys. Seriously.
Cool. Thanks, man.
You've listened to the Catholic Man Show with Adam Minahan and David Niles. This episode has been brought to you by the Catholic Woodworker, CatholicWoodworker.com. Promo code TCMS for 10% off all purchases. We've been joined today by the one and only Pat Flynn. We're on the Lord's team.
The winning side.
So raise your glass.
And cheers to Jesus.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers. What have you been drinking?
Yeah, we didn't even ask you.
Chamomile tea.
Oh, nice.
Ooh.
We have
So nothing too fancy tonight, you know. Taking it easy.
Chamomile is not fancy. I mean,
This one is fancy. I think it's got a little lemon in there, and
you know,
nice.
it's not English breakfast. You know, it's pretty regular.
Oh no.
Earl Grey. Is that what it is?
English breakfast, I think,
Has an Earl Grey?
is Earl Grey with a kick.
Okay.
No, I don't know, because you can
I don't know.
oversteep English breakfast, but you can't oversteep Earl Grey. So maybe they're more different than than
It's a degree instead of a kind?
I don't know,
Or a
dude.
kind
I don't know,
instead of
dude.
a degree?
I don't know.
Dude, I'm sorry if we made you a little dumber by talking to us this evening, but we had a lot of fun.
No, man, this has been a blast. Actually, I like this kind of like after work format too. Most of the podcasts I do are in the morning and afternoon. This is the latest podcast I've done in a while, but it's a cool way to end the day. It is. Mm-hmm.
Pros and cons of doing it at the end of the day. Usually, I can't think of words as well.
Yeah,
by the end of the day, but
This is true.
Yeah,
I hope I was coherent, by the way, because I'm
You
not
did
even sure I'm
great.
awake. Honestly.
Pat, you did awesome.
No, you did great.
Like,
I was like,
it's very
mentally, I was already like kind of already exhausted coming into this episode, and I was like, I wanted to put my best foot forward because I liked your show so much, and you talk to all these smart people, and it's like, man, I just want to be kind of smart.